order to explain how I reconciled my past, I have to talk about my education, especially since we're in an education institution, and also my own failure academically in life, because I think it's very important to know that out of bad things that can happen to you academically, good things can also happen. So the big thing is I pride myself for the last 44 years making films about underknown Jewish heroes through film. And I have concentrated dealing with fascism, anti-Semitism, sexism, racism, especially against Native Americans and African Americans. But this all starts from my high school education. Anyone from Detroit or family from Detroit? So I came to Detroit when I was 4 years old, and I went to a wonderful high school. It was called Cass Tech. It was an all-city high school, and it was in that school that were the seeds of me later on deciding I had to do my roots travel. So this also has to do with how important high schools can be. So here I'm at school. I came when I was 4. I was born in Berlin after the war. I had an accent. Kids made fun of my English. My parents also very much had accents. But somehow by the time I got to high school, I was okay in terms of speaking, although I've never been good on spelling. As a matter of fact, my nieces make fun of me because I always say English wasn't my first language when I misspell. Thank God for automatic checking and computers. Anyhow, my mother was a Polish Jew who, if you saw the film, you know that she passed as a Polish Catholic to survive during the war. I was born in Berlin after the war because my dad was in the U.S. Army, but I was born an American citizen. I could even be your president, but don't worry, I'm not running. But if you later on see me at at the reception, you can see who I want you to vote for. In any event, and also my uncle survived Auschwitz, and the rest of my grandparents know. But what was explained in the introduction, in a lot of children of survivors' homes, and there's a lot of psychological research being done about this, as well as people like myself talking about it. And I think it's true of other people who grow up with sort of a tragedy in their families. Either the family or that person who's a survivor talk about it nonstop, or they don't talk about it at all. I belong to the later category. And that's why school was very important, especially this high school that I went to. But just prior to doing that, when I was 13, I first learned about the Holocaust. And what was that? There's a very famous book called Exodus by Leon Uris. Now, I mention it because on one hand, it's a fictional book. It's not entirely historically correct, but it's the first time I heard about Auschwitz and the Holocaust. So I started thinking and talking, but you know in your home, you don't bring up the Holocaust. This is true. Anything was on TV. My parents were divorced around that time. My mother remarried. If there was anything on TV about the Holocaust, mother doesn't watch it. But that doesn't mean her daughter doesn't. So what happened is I took an English class with Mr. Young, and they had John Hersey's book called The Wall. And all of a sudden, we're reading a book about the Warsaw Ghetto and the Holocaust and where and what concentration camp they turn out to go to. And I'll never forget, Mr. Young says, like in an English class and you're reading a novel, what was the important, dramatic turn in the book? And I put up my hand and I said, that they wound up going to a concentration camp and being gassed. I didn't even know that was part of my family story. But it was one of these kernels that started happening. Now, of course, my mother, even though we lived in Detroit, and my uncle, who survived Auschwitz, lived in Hartford, whenever they came together, they would talk about the family, but they did it in Polish. I only know a few words in Polish. So one thing I recommend is learn the languages of your family, because you'll learn a lot more and maybe not even tell them. But that's another whole story. There's actually a very funny story about that. So I always knew when my uncle was coming in town, because I'd hear my mother's talking Polish, and she's a great cook. And all of a sudden in the bathtub, there'd be a fish. Why? Because my mother, from scratch, would make the homemade dish that their mother made. It's called gefilte fish. It's delicious, but don't try to replicate it. My girlfriends and I tried to do it, and all we did was have very smelly kitchens and cars. But anyhow, my mother made a great gefilte fish. But seriously, when I started doing, and I don't know your family backgrounds, but this may also happen with you, I would see every movie I could or read any book I could on the Holocaust, but I could never discuss it at home. However, when my parents divorced, my father was a little different because he had been originally from Lithuania, but had come earlier before the war, was a U.S. soldier, which is why I was born a citizen, and he would talk about it more, what he would know. And ironically, or coincidentally, my stepfather was a history professor, but of ancient Near Eastern history. Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent really has nothing to do with modern-day European history, but at least I was brought up with a sense of history, which I really recommend to anyone. Even if you don't major in history, it's really an important field to do. So as I was growing up, I kept on searching, who can I identify, especially either what I think my mother went through. And we all know the Diary of Anne Frank. There was also a dramatic interpretation of that, and that was very important to me. But I'll never forget, there was a film that came out in '65 called The Pawnbroker, where you may not know the name of these actors, but if anyone's a film buff or interested, Rod Steiger, I thought, gave one of the grand performances about a survivor who's a pawnbroker with all these memories. It was the same year, though, that I watched the Academy ceremony in '66, where Lee Marvin was up for being a drunk cowboy in Cap Blue. Now, don't get me wrong, Lee Marvin did a great job, but here I'm sitting alone in my college dorm, University of Michigan, go Blue, although I hate football. I'm only baseball. And all of a sudden they, announced the 5 actors, and Lee Marvin is a drunk cowboy, beats Rod Steiger. And that's just, I started crying because, I'm going to do it again, because I thought the portrayal of a survivor was a lot more important. And maybe there was something in me then that thought, I got to get a revenge for this. I've got to portray it somehow. So again, a little bit of a kernel. In any event, it's funny because years later, my niece wound up going to Michigan, and it was the place I watched that Oscar that night. Turned out to be her college dorm. But I'll tell you the film that really made a difference. I don't know if you know about the book Roots, that there was then a film series, a TV series, and that was before we could tape. I'll never forget, every night I would watch Roots, and I started thinking, boy, again, a little bit of a kernel, maybe I should do something about my family. And then even more so, in '78 was a series called Holocausts, Meryl Streep and others, where again, they're showing what happened to a family. So here I'm saying it was popular culture, it was TV, it was popular books, although I would say John Hershey's book, The Wall, is more, more classic, because a lot of Leon Uris is his making up. In any event, I decided, I really should try to do something. So at least I had the curiosity to think, what am I going to do? So I go off to the University of Michigan, very active on the college newspaper, studying psychology, very active in the anti-war movement, which is the only time I went to a football game to protest the war. You can imagine how popular I was and others. And then I decided, maybe I was thinking about going to law school, and I wound up getting a master's in urban planning, and went off to Vista in New Mexico and got very involved in Native American activities And there's a great sense of history among the Native American communities. And I learned a lot from the fellow activists that I was supposed to be doing urban planning. I was really doing political, sort of clandestine activity, which helped later on when I made the film. But again, I learned from others how important your history is, and if you think something's wrong, do something about it. But at that point, I thought, oh, maybe I better go to law school. So I wound up coming to Washington 50 years ago, and it was a law school called Antac School of Law that then became UDC. And a lot because of the interest of my own family and friends, I went into human rights law and immigration law. And it was a very political time, especially with Latin America, trying to save people coming from under Chilean, military dictatorships. Orlando Letelier was assassinated here. And I said, okay, that's what I'm going to do. However, do you all know to be able to become a lawyer, you have to pass the bar? Now, let me just tell you, half of the bar is multiple choice. It has nothing to do with how good a lawyer you could be. I ran a clinic. I was great. I really understood the law. But I didn't pass the bar, and actually twice I didn't. My mother used to be horrified that I mention it, but I say it now because I really thank the D.C. bar for flunking me twice. And, those kind of multiple choice questions are parallel to the kind of tests you have to take to get into undergrad. So please do not let that bring you down either mentally or emotionally, because there's a lot more to be done than passing those multiple choice questions. In any event, I wound up deciding, listen, maybe I need to do something else. And that was in 1976, my father had died. And I decided, okay, let me do something else. And I wound up seeing a history book called Image Before My Eyes, which was about Polish Jews between the wars. And then I remembered Mila 18. I went and read it for the third time, and I decided, I always say I was sort of struck by lightning. Let me go make a film about Jews fighting Nazis. Now, I'm telling you specifically my story, but you may have parallel stories either about your family background or topics that interest you. So I decided, okay, I'm going to fight back in my way to change the negative celluloid stereotype of Jews. Now, it is true, of course, that 6 million Jews died, but it is oftentimes just the one story of how they, were taken like sheep to slaughter, which on one hand is true, but on the other hand, people don't bring up the cultural and the armed resistance. And oftentimes show the survivor, especially the female survivor, is totally Meshuggah crazy. And I give an example of that is Enemies of Love Story and Sophie's Choice. That's a whole other lecture. But here I have my mother at home, and I thought there's something more to this. So I decided, okay, let me go make this film on Jewish partisans. And interestingly enough, or coincidentally enough, I found through my political connections of human rights work, Barbara Koppel's sound editor, Josh Roletsky, who did the sound for her film on Harlan County, USA, had made the film based on the book Image Before My Eyes. And I went to him and I said, hey, let's do this. Now, luckily, there's a government grant called the National Endowment for the Humanities Agency, and they funded it on this. And also my uncle, who had survived the war and became very wealthy. You saw the film, you saw that. So out of that, we made Partisans of Vilna. And this was way before the museum was built. So I think a lot of it has to do with what you don't hear, but you want to hear. At some point in your life, you say, I've got to do something about it. And sure enough, that's exactly what I wound up doing. And then after Partisans was done, I was getting dressed and ready to go to the opening, and this, we're talking about 86, and I heard a very famous baseball player named Hank Greenberg, who in 38 almost broke Babe Ruth's record. And this was my dad's hero, had died. And I thought, oh, I got to make his story. So again, an influence, if it wasn't my mother's story, it was very much my father, what he was telling me. And as I have said, he had since passed away. You know, our most religious Jewish holiday is Yom Kippur, and the opening night is a service called Kol Nidre. And every time my father would take my brother and I to services, we would always bring up Hank Greenberg. I thought Hank Greenberg was part of Kol Nidre services. He's not, but in my father's world, he was. And I decided I had to make a film about him. It took me 13 years, and if any of you were thinking about going into film, just know a lot of it is also finding the funding. In any event, not only did I make it, the film came out 25 years ago, was one of the biggest successes, won all these audience awards, and now as we speak, 25 years later, I remastered it, which means it was shot on 16, bumped up to 35, but now the whole thing is, the people who are the audiovisual people, if they'll understand what I'm saying, it's remastered into 4K. And I'm now in New York every weekend showing the film, but also trying to counter the stereotype that I think exists on the screen, which is the nebbishy Jewish male. So again, it's part of my goal in life. And also he was a great player, first one to go off at war. You know, when we have asterisks, when you have baseball statistics, for Hank Greenberg and Ted Williams, who went to 2 wars, Joe DiMaggio, Bob Feller, they all should have asterisks. They lost many years fighting in World War II, and they should be what we call recognized for the fact that they had that disadvantage. And again, I was able, through the media of film, is to tell the story of the anti-Semitism. What I didn't realize when I made the film, I remastered that, and I decided to do this a half a year ago, was the rise of anti-Semitism again. So again, I'm trying to use it to say, hey, just like racism doesn't exist and sexism, you can't do it, and let's learn from this, and you know, maybe we can do something here and showing it here too. So in any event, after I had that film out, what's interesting is things are coming up. Like you saw, someone we know who's running for office was just had this big, rally at Madison Square Gardens. And they've been invoking in the press that in 1939, the Nazis had a rally. Well, sure enough, that's in my film about Hank Greenberg. And I was showing the film the other night in New York, 3 miles away from it. And I was thinking, oh, maybe I should go down there. And my niece says to me, don't, they'll beat you up. So, and I was busy with the Q&A. But it's interesting how the stories of the past can still come out. But one thing that happened nice in bringing out the film is I went back to Detroit 90 days to the year when Hank Greenberg, during a pennant race when he's the best hitter, did not play. He went to synagogue on Kol Nidre that I just explained about. And everyone stood up when he came in. It was a really big deal. Plus, he was the best hitter. But what's interesting is at the same time, Henry Ford, had these dealerships. He was passing out the Protocols of Zion, which are the principles of Nazism, for free. And then there was a church called the Shrine of the Little Flower that a lot of us, when we grew up, it was like the Klan for us, and our fathers would always point it out. That church has decided that they are no longer going to write in their description about Father Coughlin that he was allegedly an anti-Semite. They have just taken that out. So slowly, things are happening that are different. And the other thing that's really great about Hank Greenberg, which I love that I've been able to portray, that in his last year he was unfairly traded to the Pittsburgh Pirates. And he wound up to be, that was the year 47, that Jackie Robinson integrated baseball, and Hank was the best and the only player to openly welcome Jackie, and that's what ends the film. And, talks about a lot, I think, the solidarity between African Americans and Jews. And that's why I was so proud to make a film called Rosenwald, which actually has Maryland roots, because Julius Rosenwald ran Sears and Roebuck in Chicago, but got very involved with Booker T. Washington to work on building 5,000 schools for African Americans at the turn of the century before the Great Migration. And little did I know, did you realize Maryland is Southern in terms of these schools? I mean, I'm so stupid. I always think Baltimore, that seems North, but no. There are a lot of Rosenwald schools in the Maryland area, and the great thing is how they've been restored. And, we also talk very much about the role of women. And I'll never forget when I finished this baseball film, I was on a sports show. And by the way, the film was not only made by a woman, but edited also by a woman. I remember walking off that sports show 25 years ago, and one guy said to the other, "Boy, she knows a lot about baseball as a broad." So I think I continue to dispel that myth. In any event, we all talk about Lucille Ball, and don't get me wrong, she was fabulous. She had a great show. Her comic skills were unbelievable. But before her, there were the Goldbergs. And there was a woman named Gertrude Berg who was very wealthy, spoke a regular English, but then she developed this whole character of Molly Goldberg. It was sort of the Jewish mother, but it was in a very positive way, one who was very nurturing to her family, one who was very fair, and I'm very proud I was making that, although unfortunately, I don't know how many people know about the blacklist. That's when people in Hollywood were accused of being communists, and the man who played her stage husband, Philip Loeb, was accused of that, and she protected him as long as she could. Then he could no longer stay on that, and he wound up killing himself. So it's very upsetting to me in terms of what happened to him. But again, I'm really glad to have told the story. And when we go back to mentioning Rosenwald, he not only funded the schools, but he gave grants to people like Gordon Parks, Maya Angelou, John Lewis, Augustus Savage. Right now there's an exhibit, we were just talking about that, a Gordon Parks exhibit at the National Gallery. So this is, again, the history of philanthropy in America. Darren Walker, who's just leaving the Ford Foundation, said that Julius Rosenwald was the greatest model of giving. And there's, I would recommend you all try to visit a Rosenwald school through one of your classes, because you have a great legacy right here. And then we have someone like Mo Berg. Can you imagine in today's world, a baseball player? I mean, pick anyone you want, wind up going off to war and being a spy. Of course, because of social media, we could never have that. But Mo Berg was a catcher who, as someone said, could speak in 7 languages but couldn't hit in any of them. Oftentimes, the catchers aren't the best hitters. In any event, he spied, and we needed to find out during World War II if the Nazis had nuclear capability, and he was one of the ones that really made it happen. So I'm sort of going through all my films because I'm saying, for me, it's the way those kernels that I first started thinking, what can I do? What are the answers I need to answer? I've done in film. I assure you, not all of you will be filmmakers because it's just a little overwhelming, although color could vote if you decide to, and I'd be happy to make some suggestions, and I'm always looking for interns. But there's other ways you can do something in terms of trying to tell history. And right now, I don't know if any of you have heard of Ben Hecht, but maybe you've heard of Hitchcock. He worked with Hitchcock a lot. He's an incredible screenwriter. Some people said he was 80% of all script models, like from comedy to gangster movies to romance, that he wrote the first scripts. But in the end of the 30s, when he realized what was happening, he dropped everything and was very active in trying to save European Jewry, one of time that our State Department were not giving visas. So that's the other film I'm working on. And I just want to tell you a little, because you're hearing it now from me. There's a whole phenomena that's developed. I'm 77, but those of us who we call ourselves 2G, second generation, or 3G, if you watch Wolf Blitzer, he's the son of Holocaust survivors. He actually did voiceover. If you saw my film, Pocket Full of Miracles. If you see Senator Bennett of Colorado speak, his mother was a survivor. If you want baseball history, the historian for MLB, John Thorne, like myself, was born in Germany. If you ever read Kim Masters, who's just one of the great exposers of injustices in Hollywood, she works for the Hollywood Reporter. Her mother was on the Kindertransport. And my two best friends, Dr. Eva Fogelman, does work with children of survivors, but not just of Holocaust survivors. People who come out of the Native American culture whose families were torn apart. I don't know if you've heard these horrible stories of how they were torn apart from the reservation and brought to these schools and denied speaking their languages or being exposed to their culture. And there is a movie opening up next week that I really recommend called A Real Pain with Jesse Eisenberg. This is a feature film about he and his cousin trying to see their roots, and they are what we call 3G. So one thing I'd like to say, as much to the professors here as the students, one thing that I've seen when people come out of my film, and the one thing I tell people is, try to find your family stories. It is so important. I mean, for me, it was the Holocaust, but there are so many more stories. And I would say, ask your students to unearth any correspondence, any photograph, any documents your families have, and ID them, even if it's just for the family. It's a growing up. Maybe you'll find out there's a Rosenwald school your family went to, or the family was something else in Scandinavia or wherever your family's from. There was a great article in the paper yesterday, New York Times, where a guy is going through the archives, and the famous composer Chopin, they just found out a new composition he did. I mean, the archivist, there's a trove of stuff that's not been discovered. Do interviews with any family members you have that are still alive. My biggest problem is, and I am so grateful to Steven Spielberg, because 30 years ago he started the Shoah Foundation Project. My uncle was interviewed for it, and he got my mother too. Everything that they did not tell my brother and I or my cousins are in those interviews, and that's why I made the film. Do you know what my cousin told me? Because my uncle survived Auschwitz, he had a number on his arm, that when my cousin Arnold was young, he asked my uncle, "Well, what's that number?" And my uncle said, "Oh, it's a phone number." Well, it wasn't enough numbers, but that's how he just didn't want to talk about it. And it was interesting because only when my brother, we were all for a bar mitzvah or a wedding in Hartford with the family, my nieces came back and said to my brother, Uncle David must have been a bad boy because he has this tattoo. That's when my brother told them about the Holocaust. I mean, every family decides their own. But I think when you see the Jesse Eisenberg movie, you'll see that that's an important way. I know myself. I mean, look, I'm a historian in filmmaking. I do roots films. I always ask, like, my Uber driver or my, red cap or whoever. I'm also trying to make sure they're voting for a certain candidate that you obviously know who I mean, next week. But it's a way, I explore their upbringings. So I always say, students, try to unearth your past. I would say, teachers, assign your students to research their family stories and document them for relatives and future relatives. Encourage students to write them up as nonfiction, as fiction, as poetry. Do we have drama classes here? Make plays out of them, Write songs and sing about them. Make videos in dramas or docs. We all have family stories, and unless we go out of our way, just like I had that kernel, when I first read The Wall when I was young, that I started realizing, or when I first saw, Holocaust on TV, or even Roots, it's those kernels that got me going. You can start much earlier. I never knew grandparents, but if you have grandparents, please find out their stories. And as I said, what Steven Spielberg has done is so important. Now, for those who saw the film, let me just tell you a couple of things. You saw that footage of me as a little kid. Wasn't I adorable? Right. So, well, it turns out that my father because he was doing newspaper reporting, had with him a photographer all the time. What I didn't know is he had a cameraman. That reel of film has been among my dad's papers for 75 years. After he died, I brought it back. He had moved to Israel. I brought it back to the States. It sat there. Only when I was making this film, and I was 6 months into the film, I thought, where's that reel of film? We found the reel of film, and it's just perfect. I mean, no one has that. And it's because my dad, someplace, I'm trying to figure it out, he had a cameraman. And if you look at it, the shadows look great. Everything's great. But I thought the film was taken in Berlin. So I go last year to show the film in Berlin, and then I go visit friends. There's a wonderful filmmaker, unfortunately, passed away in Munich, Michael Verhoeven, and married to this wonderful actress named Senta Berger. She sees the film, and she says to me, Aviva, you say it's Berlin. That zoo is Munich. I had the wrong ID for it. Luckily, she told me last year, I took the line out in Munich. Not only that, we found the house I lived in. They had me go visit, and in the backyard, for those of you who've seen the film, were apple trees. So can you imagine what it was for my mother the 2 times we were living there? You have to see the film. I don't want to spoil it other than that. So again, and for me, making the film, I never knew they had horses. I mean, I knew my grandfather was wealthy. I knew that relative standards. I knew he was in the lumber business. But, there's just so many stories there I just didn't know. So don't wait to try to replicate something decades later. Do it now. And of course, out of all of this, and hearing their testimonies, there's a word in Yiddish, chutzpah. They had a lot of gall to survive, but also to make it in America. So I'm proud of the film because I think it shows how people can make it. I'm proud of my dad because he did those stories. That's how he met my mother, covering her being reunited with my uncle. And just to mention, anyone else beside myself living in D.C.? No. Well, I dedicate all the films because I make in D.C. the fact that we should have statehood, also Puerto Rico, but that could be another question, and serve peace in the Middle East and returning the hostages. And if you want to see my mother's artwork, you can go to Helen Kovinsky, COVENSKY.org.